now.
Great, so it's my pleasure to kick off this episode of our GIS 101 series that's designed to demystify geospatial topics for people without a GIS background. These webinars are a tool for NSGIC members and others to use with the many people we deal with who could benefit from learning more about key GIS topics. With us today to discuss orthoimagery is Tim Johnson. Tim is the director of the North Carolina Center for Geographic Information and Analysis, which is part of the North Carolina Department of Information Technology, and he staffs the North Carolina Geographic Information Coordinating Council. Tim is also a part of NSGIC's volunteer leadership, and he currently co-chairs the Member Resources Working Group. Thank you so much, Tim, for being here, and I will just turn it over to you to dive into orthoimagery.
Okay, thanks, Molly. Appreciate the opportunity to share this. Orthoimagery is one of those things that has always got me real excited because it's graphic. So in our work in North Carolina, it's very important, and I think that goes the same for other states in the country. Orthoimagery really is a foundation for GIS, either at the state or the local level and the federal level for that matter. Some of the early uses of orthoimagery date back to periods of conflict at the national level, national defense, reconnaissance kinds of things, such as, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis from the early 60s. They used orthoimagery to locate things that were going on during that conflict, and lots of other purposes. So in the public sector, it really is a foundation layer for other GIS data sets that are created, such as the foundation for mapping street center lines, parcel boundaries, which are property boundaries, and natural features such as rivers and streams. So it's really core to everything the GIS professional is doing, either at the state or the local level. And it's also helpful in incidences where you need a situational assessment of what's happening on the ground. It gives you that instant look at what's on the ground relevant to emergency response, for example, 911. It's become really important, as we all know, in our daily lives because we can access some form of orthoimagery through tools like Google Maps and other tools that we use on smartphones or other devices. So it's really reaching the public in ways that it never did decades ago. So let me back up and just state just a quick definition of orthoimagery, because it's an unusual term for some people. It's interchangeable really with the terms aerial photography, orthophotography, and then orthoimagery being the one we're using today. So they all pretty much mean the same thing. It's aerial photography taken from an aircraft or satellite that's corrected to the surface of the Earth, or orthorectified. So the three-dimensional nature of the Earth, as represented in elevation data, is used to mathematically correct the photography that's taken from the airplane or the satellite. Typically, this data is acquired through fixed-wing aircraft, and I'll just move to a slide to show you that graphically. So what happens in these situations is this sensor or digital camera is mounted to the belly of the airplane. You can see the circle in the bottom of that plane. And that's really what takes the photography as you fly down what's called a flight line to capture imagery along the surface of the Earth. In the old days, this was done with film cameras, but these digital sensors create digital data instantaneously that's used to process and then make it orthorectified, as I said earlier. These are $1 million cameras. These are not your average Nikon or Canon cameras that you use on a personal basis. They're very, very complex, very sophisticated, and manufactured only by a few people in the world, really. So what happens with imagery? It's taken from anywhere between 5,000 and 20,000 feet, depending on the aircraft and the sensor. And as I said earlier, goes along a flight line, captures the imagery, and as basis for creating a digital surface of photography. When it's flying, and the product that comes from the flights, there are 4 bands that are collected. The color bands, the primary colors are red, green, and blue, but also a color infrared band. And that color infrared band is used for different purposes than the regular red, green, and blue. But all of them together are super important. I want to talk for a second about the differences in the types of imagery that are important for state and local governments and others. And one of those types is called leaf-on imagery. And this is imagery that's taken during the summer, typically when leaves are on the trees, crops are in the fields, and as state GIS coordinators, we are part of the National Agricultural Imagery Program, or NAEP, that's funded out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So that organization flies the country, several states per summer. I think North Carolina was last flown in 2018, for example. But what that yields is a product that's used for assessing agricultural productivity. How are those crops in the fields looking? We're looking at things like tree canopy in the forested areas and other areas where obscuring what's on the ground from a man-made feature perspective is not critical. It's typically collected at either 1 meter or nowadays at 50 to 60 centimeters resolution, meaning each pixel represents 1 meter on the ground, for example. And that imagery is used in a number of purposes aside from agricultural productivity, but very important as a component in the GIS database, either at the state or the local level. The other type of photography that's flown is called leaf-off photography, and that's flown in the wintertime when all of the deciduous trees have lost their leaves. So all you have in terms of vegetation is the evergreen set of plants and so forth, trees. And this imagery is been typically flown in the past by individual counties or states as a whole. In our work in North Carolina, we have a statewide program where we fly a quarter of the state per year at a resolution of 6 inches. So each pixel represents 6 inches on the ground, which is pretty detailed. And it's used for a number of things. The first and probably foremost and the earliest use of it was for tax assessment purposes. So if you're a county tax assessor and you need to see what's on the ground for a particular piece of property, you need to know which areas are built, how many structures there are, and that's becomes one of the bases for taxing that piece of property. But there are many other uses, including highway planning. You know, the state DOT here and other states, I'm sure, uses this imagery for that purpose. You can do other things such as map the locations of buildings and get their footprints. It's also used in economic development, and certainly one of the biggest these days is emergency response and 911 to locate the area where an event is happening, where a response is needed, gives an instantaneous look at what's going on there. So I've got a few examples of the leaf-off type of imagery. So the first one is tax assessment, and in this slide you can see the imagery on the bottom. You can tell the leaves are off the trees. You can also pick out all the structures, and the black lines that are a little bit vague, but I think you can see them, those are the property boundaries. So the property boundaries are mapped using the imagery as part of the basis for the mapping. You can also overlay flood zones, which is what this next graphic shows, for public safety and disaster response. So if there is a projected hurricane coming with a projected amount of rainfall, there are models that can show where that rain is going, where it's going to flood first, and that can be shown in relation to the imagery. And in this case, the yellow rectangles represent areas that will be flooded. And the final example here is the transportation planning example, where DOT is using this data to plan in detail elements of an improvement to a highway somewhere in North Carolina.
Oh, great.
So I'll stop there and see if there are questions. That gives you the broad brush of what the products are and how they're used.
Great. Do states often share this information, or is this pretty much information that you gathered that is really just very specific to each individual state?
We share it broadly through the public records law in our state. We typically make it available through something called NC1 Map. We provide the data to all of the emergency responders in the state directly. We provide the data at our borders to each of the other states, and we ask the other states to contribute imagery from their data resources if they have imagery for their areas. Because it's important to be able to look across those state boundaries, not just the county boundaries, but across the state boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
But we freely share it, no cost to anyone who wants to see it. We also provide something called image services, which is a way for users to embed access to the imagery in their applications. So they don't need to download it. They can just subscribe to the image service, and it gives them a tie directly to the data.
Oh, wow. And you said that you were showing the picture of the camera, and maybe I missed this. Is it just mostly airplanes that are able to capture this data, or do you use satellites?
We don't use satellites, but satellites are up that capture the data at a pretty detailed level. Mm-hmm. Some of NSGIC's sponsoring companies have access to those satellites and that data. But we use fixed wing aircraft based sensors and collecting. So a couple of the companies that are under contract with us include Surdex and Sanborn, who are NSGIC sponsors. There are others, obviously, but those are the two in particular that have done work for us and with other states too.
Okay. Any other questions from anybody?
Hey, Tim, this is Karen. Can you describe more what the infrared band does for data analysis?
The infrared band, I've got a sample of that. I'll bring that up real quick. So the infrared band allows for this really good distinction between man-made features and natural features. So in this case, buildings versus trees and vegetative cover. So the origin of the color infrared band is actually from World War II, when they were trying to distinguish between camouflage tanks and actual vegetative cover on the ground. And since camouflage that's not natural is a different signature, if you will, on the ground, it gave them a clear distinction between what was man-made and what wasn't. So vegetative cover is an important one. Land cover classification processes can be developed using the fourth band, and impervious surface extraction is relatively easy to do, and that's, in North Carolina at least, that's becoming more and more of an issue as more and more of the state gets developed and moves from agricultural and open land to buildings and parking lots and all those kinds of things. It's a big deal in the cities such as Charlotte and Raleigh and Greensboro.
And just to add on to that, is it true that different plant types give off different signatures? So you can also use it to, I mean, it kind of goes to your land classification topic, but you know, can you just describe a little bit about how the specific signature is tied to species? Right.
So each representation of the color infrared band is a different, offers a different signature for within the color infrared spectrum, and that gives an indication of different species. And I honestly don't know the guts of how that's done or what those specific values are, but I know there's a range of values that represents a type of, you know, deciduous tree, for example. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Tim, this is Harpinder. I had a question. So I
Sure.
saw that there were a few slides where there was that 4-year refresh. Is there, so when you're actually taking these images, is it something that's being done constantly or as needed?
That's a good question. So what happens is, in the case of the eastern part of North Carolina, that's shown in light blue, what has to happen is the leaves obviously have to be off the trees. There has to be a sun angle such that it minimizes shadows. That's more important in mountainous areas, honestly, than it is on the coast. And then there has to be a relatively cloud-free day. It has to be an area where rivers and streams are within their banks, so it's not within the standard to collect imagery when rivers and streams are outside their banks, which occasionally happens in heavy rainy periods. So what typically happens in the winter capture cycle is there's a period of time in the eastern part of North Carolina in February and March where all of those conditions are perfect or near perfect, and the flights are made during that time. As you move west, and you know, Karen can appreciate this from her part of the country, as it gets later in the year in the west, where the mountains are significant, you have a higher, you have a greater ability to extend the flying season into April because the leaves don't come on the trees as fast as they do on the east. So you're always concerned about what we call leaf out, where buds are coming on the trees that could potentially impact the value of the imagery because it obscures what's on the ground. So typically we find there are about 6 perfect days within the February and March timeframe where the conditions are right to collect. And that's pretty much true across the state, whichever area you're in.
So
And this is all, I guess one of the things I didn't say is this is all done to a standard. So the standard is specific about the percent of cloud cover and those kinds of factors. And in our state, we quality check the imagery. If we see too much cloud cover, or if we see a lot of blurring of the imagery, which could be a result of turbulence in the aircraft during the flights, then we will reject those flights. That doesn't happen very often, but it has happened.
So is it done once a year then?
Yes. So one flight season will capture that area on the east. One flight season captures the area in the green there, and so forth.
Okay.
So by the end of the 4-year cycle, we've collected everything across the state. And one thing I'll say about the funding side of this, I've got a slide for it. So before 2010 in North Carolina, it was up to individual counties to collect their own. So some counties had imagery as of 2010 that was, 6, 7 years old. And the 911 board saw NextGen 911 coming, and the fact that a mobile device anywhere in the state could be calling from anywhere in the state. And we needed to have a clear, consistent, current picture of the imagery. So we could not rely on an individual county that may not be able to afford to fly imagery within a regular cycle to continue to do that. So the 911 board decided to pick up the responsibility and make it more consistent. And that's what led to the 4-year cycle that you saw in the previous map. I'll also say, just as a programmatic thing, on the right slide. And maybe I'll quiz you guys. So in North Carolina, this is the statewide imagery that was collected in 2010 as the foundation for the 4-year cycle. So you see a number of white areas there, and those areas are not they're not natural features on the landscape. Any guesses as to what they might be?
I see one really close to Fayetteville, so I'm going to guess they are military bases.
That's right. So the one in Fayetteville is Fort Bragg. The one in the southeastern part of the state is Camp Lejeune. And there's one further south in Wilmington is an Army depot for materials and supplies coming into the state or leaving the state. And then there's a curious one in the upper northeastern part of the state. It's a very small rectangle. And the story behind that one was it is a training facility for the intelligence community. So the reason those aren't shown is because they're not allowed to be public data. So we capture everything. We work with the Army, the Air Force, and the Marine Corps to fly their areas and provide their areas to them. So they allow us to fly, but we provide the product straight to them. The product doesn't end up in the public realm. But they're great partners. They want to do their part because this is part of the total emergency response picture in North Carolina. So for those military bases, they respond to 911 calls in and around their perimeter as well as on their property. So it's important for not only the bases, but the county and city 911 centers to be looking at the same data. So they have access to that. It's just not publicly available through an NC1 map kind of product.
Do you know what happens in states that have a lot of tree cover throughout the year, like, in the Pacific Northwest, and they don't lose a lot of leaves in their really forested areas?
I do not know as much about their program, but I can imagine that it's very challenging to be able to visualize structures on the ground with all of the evergreen trees they have.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely an issue. There must be another approach to, tax assessment and those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So I would add, excuse me, I would add a thought to Harpender's question about the refresh period and the importance of that. So in the Western states, especially those that have a lot of energy development, we rely on imagery to provide us with change detection. In particular, looking at areas that have been, where the ground has been disturbed for oil and gas extraction or other, mineral activities. So it's important to have, excuse me, a, fairly frequent refresh cycle so that we can stay on top of tracking permitted activities and reclamation efforts.
I will add that in our case, the 4-year cycle was developed through a business plan that was written by a working group of our council, and they looked at a half a dozen different alternatives for the number of phases or the number of cycles to cover the state. And the 4-year cycle ended up being the selected one because it spread out the money over the most number of years. And it was a logical break geographically for the state. The green, the green and blue boundary, for example, is basically the difference between the Piedmont and the coastal plain in North Carolina. And the boundary in the west between the yellow and the purple was done so the contractors wouldn't have to fly the entire mountainous area of North Carolina in one flying season, because there's risk of snow obscuring the ground, and if you only have 5 or 6 potential days to fly, we didn't want to put that much risk into a single year.
Question on the differences between the satellites and the flights. Does it mean the satellites can only take pictures during those given days as well?
No, the satellites are activated, all the time, and I think you just have to rely on those vendors to provide you with the data whenever those satellites are flying over your geographic area. So they're circling in an orbit.
Hey, Tim, this is Jamie. Question regarding resolution. So could you have in one cycle within that or one color, I guess you would say, within that 4-year cycle, be at a certain resolution and have a neighboring color next to it, still in the same 4-year cycle, be a different resolution? And if that is the case, does that cause any headache or challenges?
Well, one of the things we encourage is for local governments to buy up if they feel like they need to. So Wade County, there in the center of the green, is the Raleigh area. Charlotte is Mecklenburg County in that purple area. There's some other urban areas that buy up to 3-inch. And what we try to do, we have a 6-inch product, so they buy up to 3-inch, and we work with the contractors and the counties to kind of meld those together to make up that big green footprint, for example. So if you looked at Wake County's data as a result of that buy-up, if you zoom in, you will get to the 3-inch product. So it's integrated with the 6-inch product because we try to have clear definition of where those boundaries are.
Okay, thank you.
Uh, 6-inch product is fairly standard, but I know there are other states that have a 1-foot product that's their standard product. And I think it just depends on, you know, the characteristics of your state as to what is sufficient. And we've just found that 6 inches is sufficient for the most needs.
Yeah.
One of the additions we'll make to our program starting in 2020 is going to be the addition of the color infrared band for each of those 4 colors that you see on the map. So the 911 board has decided to fund that additional cost because we've shown them that there's value for the emergency responders being able to differentiate man-made structures versus natural features using the color infrared band. And it's all flowing at the same time. It's, you know, it's the same camera collects all 4 bands. So it's already being collected. It's just not being processed currently.
Well, we're right at about 30 minutes. Does anyone have any additional questions they want to ask before we close out? Okay, well, thank you so much, Tim. This was really informative, and I've learned a lot more than I expected to today. So I really appreciate you helping us out and joining us for our GIS 101 session.
Great, glad to do it. I hope it was helpful.
Definitely. All right, thank you.
Okay, so long.